tried to do in my book, Human Devolution, is give some rational scientific justification for thinking that these things are true. And I'm not claiming any monopoly on truth, either for myself or for the Vedic perspective. I think truth can be found in many places, and I encourage people to look wherever their path leads them. Mine has led me in a certain direction, but others may follow different paths. The first thing I want to show is that we really do need an alternative explanation for human origins in strictly scientific terms. Let's first look at what the current theories tell us. They tell us that life began on Earth from chemicals about 2 billion years ago. Then simple life forms arose in the oceans. Then they went to the land. Then about 40 or 50 million years ago, you get the first apes and monkeys. And then about 6 million years ago, you get the first ape men. And then finally, about 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, you get humans like us for the first time on Earth. But ancient wisdom traditions tell a different story. For example, the ancient Sanskrit writings of India tell us that humans have existed since the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. We're not a recent appearance here. But many scientists will say, okay, well, that's what your mythology says, but all the physical evidence supports our point of view. It supports this evolutionary picture of human origins that we see here. But when I did 8 years of research into the entire history of archaeology, I found that there is physical evidence showing that humans like us have existed for millions and millions of years on Earth, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life here. And this evidence takes the form of human bones, human footprints, and human artifacts, many, many millions of years old. So I documented this evidence in this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which is about 900 pages long. Some people call it Forbidding Archaeology because it just seems like too much to pick up. So we brought out this book in a shorter edition called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which has now been translated into 20 languages. This is the Russian edition, the French edition. This is the Bulgarian edition. Now, the evidence that I document in these books is not very well known because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. We can call the blue box up there the knowledge filter, and it represents the fixed ideas that most scientists today now have about this question of human origins. So reports of evidence that conform to these fixed ideas will pass through this intellectual filter very easily, which means that students will read about this evidence in their textbooks. People will see scientists talking about it on TV shows. If they go to the local museum, they'll see these discoveries. But if we have evidence that radically contradicts these fixed ideas, they tend to be ignored, forgotten, even actively suppressed. So I'm going to give a few examples of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist who I know personally. When she was a young woman, just after she got her PhD, she was a rising star in her profession. But then she was called to Mexico to date an archaeological site called Huayatlaco. This is the excavation at Huayatlaco. The American and Mexican archaeologists there found human artifacts in layers of solid rock. And of course, they wanted to know how old they were. So they called a team of geologists to date the site. Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site, and they got an age of about 250,000 years. But the archaeologists said, we can't accept that. That's impossible. According to their theories, human beings capable of making the artifacts didn't exist anywhere in the world at that time. They hadn't evolved yet. So they refused to publish the age for the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. And Virginia Steen McIntyre decided, well, I'll independently publish the age for the site. If these archaeologists won't publish it, I will. So she did that. And when she did, she experienced an extreme negative backlash from her colleagues in the scientific world. She was labeled a troublemaker, a publicity seeker, a maverick. She wrote to the editor of the journal that published her report, "Not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Huayatlaco has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period." So this is how this knowledge filtering process works. Now here's a case from England. This is the Red Crag Formation at a place called Walton-on-Naze. The Red Crag Formation is this layer here. It's got this reddish color. And this is where Walton-on-Naze is in East Anglia, near Ipswich. And there's some fossil shells that are found in this formation, the Red Crag Formation. Now in 1881, the geologist Henry Stopes made a report about a very interesting shell that was found at in the Red Crag at Walton-on-Naze. And here it is. It's interesting because it has a very simple but nevertheless recognizable human face carved upon it, the first happy face. And he reported on it at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Now it's interesting because the Red Crag Formation is between 2 and 3 million years old. And according to most modern scientists, the very first symbolic marks made on shell or bone by humans are less than 100,000 years old. One of the oldest examples they have is some simple marks made on a piece of bone from the Blombos cave in South Africa, and they believe it's 77,000 years old. So to have this sort of thing at 2 or 3 million years old is really quite extraordinary. It was a very controversial find at the time. Many scientists heavily criticized Henry Stopes, but his daughter, Mary Stopes, who was also a geologist, defended her father's discovery in some scientific publications. Now in the same part of England, I want to point out one thing, is that this carved shell with a human face on it has gone missing. No one can locate it today. That often happens with these discoveries related to extreme human antiquity. They tend to disappear. So that's the case with this, although we do have the photographs and original scientific reports. Now, another interesting discovery was made in the same region. It's a fossil human jaw from the same region. And this anatomically modern human jaw was found 16 feet deep in the Red Crag Formation at Foxhall in England in 1855. And Foxhall Hall is shown on this map. It's on the eastern outskirts of Ipswich, which is near to the place where the carved face was found on the the carved human face was found on the shell. So this human jawbone was also found in the Red Crag Formation, which is 2 or 3 million years old. So that's further evidence for a human presence in England going back 2 or 3 million years. Oops, wrong way. So later in the 20th century, another English researcher, J. Reed Moore of the Prehistoric Society of East Anglia, went to Foxhall and made some additional excavations there, and he found more evidence of a human presence in the form of stone tools and weapons and evidence for the deliberate use of fire. And the American anthropologist Henry Fairfield Osborne wrote, the discoveries of J. Reed Moore on the evidence of the existence of Pliocene man in East Anglia open a new epoch in archaeology. They bring indubitable evidence of the existence of man in southeast Britain, man of sufficient intelligence to fashion flints and to build fire before the close of the Pliocene. So the Pliocene is the geological period that extends from 2 million to 5 million years ago. So there's extensive evidence that humans were existing in England between 2 and 3 million years ago. So some people might say, well, that's from the early 20th century or the 19th century. What did they know back then? Where's such evidence being discovered in more modern times? And such evidence has been found. This is Mary Leakey, who in 1979 announced the discovery of many footprints at a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania in East Africa. And she said in her original report in National Geographic magazine, the footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. And other scientists also agreed. Paleontologist Tim White said, make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints. Now that was pretty unusual because they were found in layers of solidified volcanic ash that geologists say are about 3 or 4 million years old. So at least 3 million years old. The most modern estimate says about 3,600,000 years. Now, neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that human beings like us were present to make those footprints 3 million years ago in Africa. So how did they explain the footprints? Well, they proposed there must have been some kind of ape man who had feet exactly like modern human feet, and that's how the footprints were made. That's an interesting idea, but there's no physical evidence to support it. We have the skeletons of the ape men who existed at that time. They're called Australopithecus, and their foot structure is not like that of a modern human being. The foot skeletons of Australopithecus show that their foot was very ape-like. For example, their feet had very long toes, sort of like human fingers. Actually, the only creature known to science today that has a foot exactly like that of a modern human being is, in fact, a human being like us. So, what did Mary Leakey actually find? I believe she found evidence that humans like us were present 3 or 4 million years ago in Africa. Now let's jump a little further back in time. This is the Portuguese geologist Carlos Ribeiro. He discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal. And as a geologist, he said they cannot have come from any higher, more recent level. The layers of rock in which he found these objects were about 20 million years old. So he displayed the artifacts in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. But if you go to the museum today, you won't see the artifacts displayed in those cases anymore. Today, they're kept locked in these cabinets down here. But I got permission from the director of the museum to open up those cabinets, and I was able to study and photograph some of these 20 million year old human artifacts from Portugal. By studying Ribeiro's original documents, I was able to go out into the countryside of Portugal and relocate some of the places where he made his discoveries. For example, this is the quarry at Morganheira, and here's one of the artifacts that he found there. It's a flint artifact, pointed. Now, it's interesting what happened. When Ribeiro was alive, he displayed the artifacts in the museum with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues did something interesting. They left the artifacts on display in the museum, but they wrote new labels for all of them, giving them far younger ages. This is the new label that they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. The second line here gives the age. It says in Portuguese, Paleolítico Superior. That means Upper Paleolithic. And according to modern archaeologists, that period in Europe goes back about 20,000 years. So Ribeiro's colleagues thought 20 million years, that's impossible. 20,000 years, that sounds about right. So they wrote new labels for all of the artifacts. And then the next generation of officials in the museum just put the entire collection away, new labels and all. And I'm the first researcher in over 50 years to see them. One case that's always fascinated me is the California gold mine discoveries. In the 19th century, gold was discovered in California, and miners went there to get the gold. To get the gold, they dug tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain here in California, in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And deep inside the tunnels, the miners found human bones and human artifacts. For example, they found many of these stone mortars and pestles. And what makes these discoveries so interesting to me is that they were found in layers of solid rock that belong to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which means they would be about 50 million years old. These discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney. He was the chief government geologist of California. His report was published by Harvard University, but we don't hear very much about these discoveries today because of the process of knowledge filtration. Here is the scientist most responsible for the knowledge filtering in this particular case. This is William Holmes, an anthropologist who worked at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And he wrote, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he would not have published those reports. In other words, if the facts did not support the theory, then the facts had to be set aside. And that's what happened. However, a few years ago, I was a consultant for a television program called The Mysterious Origins of Man, which was shown on NBC, the largest American television network. And the producer had read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, so he got in touch with me. He wanted to include some of the cases from the book in this documentary. So I told him he should go to the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, because I knew that some of the 50 million year old human artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the collection of that museum. So he went there, but the museum officials refused to allow him to see the artifacts, what to speak of film them. Nevertheless, we were able to find some photographs that were taken of the artifacts by Dr. Whitney in the 19th century. So we did have some imagery to use in the television program. It was interesting when scientists in America found out that NBC was going to show this program, they tried to stop NBC from showing it. They weren't successful. Actually, it was a very popular program, and recently a DVD's been released that has the entire program, plus many of the outtakes, interviews with me and others that weren't included in the broadcast show. But when scientists found out that NBC was going to show this, they tried to stop NBC. They weren't successful. So then they went to the government. They went to the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency of the government in the United States that regulates the TV broadcasting industry. And they asked the government to investigate NBC, to censure NBC, to force NBC to broadcast apologies, public apologies for having shown this program. And they also wanted the government to fine NBC millions of dollars so that they would never do anything like this again. Now, I'm happy to say the government did do this, but it was interesting to me that these sorts of attempts were made to prevent this information from reaching the people. Now, more recently, I went back to the museum myself. I was preparing a report about these discoveries for a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress, the world's largest international organization of archaeologists. And perhaps because of my connection with the World Archaeological Congress, the museum officials decided they would let me see the artifacts. And they're not kept in the museum itself. They're kept in a storage building several miles from the museum. I had to be accompanied every step of the way by a museum official, and entering this building was quite an experience, with all these card readers and security levels to go through. But the artifacts are still there, and these are some of them. These are some of the 50-million-year-old artifacts from the California gold mines. And many people have seen the movie Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where in the final scenes they go into the basements of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and see all kinds of discoveries that are being kept from the public. And many people think, well, that's just Hollywood. But these things actually do happen. There are human artifacts that are extremely old that aren't displayed to the public, but which are in the collections of these museums. After studying some of Dr. Whitney's original reports, I went into the mountains of California, and this is Table Mountain as it looks today. And we were able to relocate some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these objects were discovered, and it should be possible to do more research there. Now, how far back in time can we go with evidence like this? In the year 1862, a scientific journal called The Geologist published an interesting report. An anatomically modern human skeleton was found 30 meters below the surface of the ground in the state of Illinois in America. And according to modern geologists, the level at which the skeleton was found is about 300 million years old. And directly above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock, which was unbroken, which means the skeleton cannot have come down from any higher, more recent level. It had to be as old as the layer in which it was found. In this case, 300 million years, which is older than the dinosaurs. This interesting report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was found 5 meters deep in solid rock near Boston. According to modern geological reports, the age of the formation in which the object was found is about 600 million years. The oldest objects I found in my research come from South Africa. Miners in the western Transvaal region have found many of these round objects. They're made of hematite, which is a naturally occurring type of iron. The most interesting feature is the parallel grooves that go around the center of each object. These were shown on the NBC television program, but before NBC agreed to allow them to be shown, they said, you have to give them to an independent company of metallurgists to examine. So we did that, and the metallurgists gave a report saying they could not explain how those grooves could have formed naturally in the layers of the earth, which means they had to have been made by someone with human-like intelligence. Now these objects, these hematite spheres, are found solidly embedded in mineral deposits over 2 billion years old. So I could go on and on. I could keep you here until Christmas going through one case after another, but I'm not going to do that because there are other things I want to talk about. But I'll ask you to remember one thing. There are some scientists who say all the physical evidence supports this evolutionary picture of human origins with humans coming into existence about 100,000 years ago. It's not true that all of the physical evidence supports that idea. When we actually look at all the physical evidence, we find a continuous chain of discoveries of human bones, human footprints, human artifacts, many, many millions of years old, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth, which means we need some new explanations for human origins. And in this book, I've offered a Vedic alternative theory of human origins, which has a lot in common with ideas of human origins that we find in many ancient wisdom traditions. Now, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? We should know what it is we're trying to explain. Now, today, many scientists will tell us that a human being or any other living thing is just a complex organization of the ordinary chemical elements. We're just machines made of matter. But I believe if we carefully look at all of the evidence, we'll see that it's more reasonable to say that a human being is made of 3 things. Ordinary matter, yes, but beyond that, there is a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers. And beyond that, there is a conscious self that can exist apart from matter. So when I speak of mind and matter, I don't mean temporary byproducts of bioelectrical activity in the brain. I mean real things with their own independent existence. Now at this point, some scientists will say, now hold on just a minute. That's not how we do science. We don't start introducing all kinds of strange new substances into our picture of scientific reality like mind and consciousness. This is science. In science, we deal with what we know, and what we know is matter, the chemical elements. So therefore, if we're going to be scientific, we should try to explain everything about human origins in terms of matter organizing itself. Anything else is mythology or something, but it's not science. However, that's not really true. Modern science does operate in a way that involves introducing new substances into our picture of reality. Let's look at cosmology, for example. Until the 1970s, when astronomers looked at the sky, they tried to explain everything they could observe in terms of ordinary matter operating according to known gravitational laws. They found they were not able to do that. For example, they found they could not explain the spiral structure of galaxies in that way. To explain what they actually observed, astronomers introduced a strange new substance they call dark matter, which you cannot observe, but it has a gravitational effect. And they found even that was not enough. So more recently, they've introduced an even stranger new thing they call dark energy, which has a force that operates the opposite of gravity. Gravity attracts, this dark energy pushes things outward. So today, astrophysicists believe the cosmos is composed of only 5% ordinary matter, the chemical elements. They believe that 30% is composed of the strange new substance called dark matter, and that 65% is composed of the even stranger new substance they call dark energy. So I think the same sort of thing is necessary in biology. I don't think we can explain everything we can observe about human beings in terms of the chemical elements, ordinary matter. I think we need to introduce new substances into our picture of biological reality. And I'm not the only one who's saying that. This is Rodney Brooks, who works at the Artificial Life Lab at MIT. A few years ago, he published an interesting article in Nature. He commented that the programs of artificial life and artificial intelligence are failing to deliver the results that most scientists expected would be possible. And that's interesting because if life really is just a combination of matter, we should be able to duplicate important features of life in computers and machines like robots. And we are to a certain limited extent, but we are not able to produce anything that is remotely like what human beings are really capable of. So he was wondering, why are we failing? Could it be we don't have powerful enough computers? Maybe our algorithms aren't complex enough? He decided, no, we've got excellent computers, we've got excellent computer programmers and technicians who can build robots. What's the problem? The real problem, he said, is this. There might be some extra sort of stuff in living systems outside our current scientific understanding. And what might that extra stuff be? Among the possibilities he was considering were some ineffable entities such as a soul or elan vital, some vital force. And I agree with him. I think we do need to add some new substances into our picture of biological reality. I think we need to add a mind substance and the substance of consciousness. And I think there's some scientific justification for this. The ordinary matter we don't have to talk about. Everybody accepts that. But what about scientific evidence for the existence of a subtle mind element associated with the human organism with very unusual powers that cannot be explained by our current laws of physics? There is some evidence for this, but it's been subjected to the knowledge filtering process so that you won't find it mentioned in the official education system or scientific institutions. And I'll give some examples of evidence for a mind element. Mind is something like air. We can't see air, but when air moves over an element that we can see, like water, we can observe its effects. We can see waves forming. So mind is something like that. We cannot see the mind, but many scientists have observed the very unusual effects of mind on ordinary matter. Now, one of these scientists was a famous English scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace. He was, along with Darwin, the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection, but we rarely hear his name these days. And that's because he became interested in research into the paranormal. And when he became interested in research in the paranormal, Darwin wrote to him saying, I don't know what you're up to. I think you're going to murder our joint child, the theory of evolution, by getting into all this paranormal stuff. But Wallace continued with his research, and he was joined in his research by another prominent English scientist, Sir William Crookes, who was later a president of the Royal Society and a very prominent physicist. Together, they studied mediums. Now, mediums are people with paranormal powers. They did a lot of research with the medium Daniel Dunglass Hume, who was originally from Scotland, I believe. And Hume had some interesting abilities. You know, for example, he could take an accordion, hold it on the top end opposite the keys, and the accordion would play very elaborate tunes. So Wallace and Crookes decided to study this. They wanted to make sure that he wasn't, surreptitiously like some magician, getting his other hand down there on the keys to play it, or somehow or other tricking them. So to prevent that, they built a cage. This is their experimental apparatus. And he had to hold the accordion at the top here, opposite the keys, and this cage would prevent him from getting his other hand down there or his foot or whatever to manipulate the keys and cause it to play some very elaborate tune. Another possibility they considered was, well, maybe he had some kind of trick accordion with some mechanism inside it. So they bought a completely new accordion from a music store and used that in their experiments. And the experimental setup was like this. Hume had to sit with one hand on top of the table, his other hand on the accordion. And even under those carefully controlled conditions, he was still able to cause the accordion to play very elaborate tunes. But it doesn't stop there. Both Wallace, the co-founder of the theory of evolution, and Crookes, a president of the Royal Society, they both testified that on occasion they would see him take his hand completely out of the cage, and the accordion would be floating in the cage all by itself, playing very elaborate tunes. Now, you're not going to read about that in your physics textbooks, but these things were actually reported by these prominent English scientists. Another thing that both Wallace and Crookes observed were levitations by Hume. Now, we know that there are magicians who can perform the illusion of a levitation, but it requires some kind of apparatus. So what they would do is they would go to Hume's apartment, his lodgings in London, unannounced, and just say, "Come with us right now." And they would take him to some place he'd never been before, the home of some gentleman, a scientist or scholar, with nobody to assist him, no apparatus. They would simply take him to the middle of the parlor or whatever, and then they would observe him levitating under these circumstances. And it happened once in the home of Crookes. And he said he felt everywhere, around him, below him, beside him, over him. No wires, no apparatus. He's just floating in the air. On another occasion, the scientists had him on the third floor of a building in a room, and they observed him assume a horizontal floating position, float out a window on the third floor, and then float and come in another window horizontally, and then assume a vertical position. So I take this as evidence for a subtle mind element. Of course, those into shamanic realities will understand that mind over matter is a very real thing, and those that are able to control the mind can actually do these things. Now, another example. Every physics student learns about the work of Pierre and Marie Curie. They were husband and wife. They both got Nobel Prizes in physics for their work in discovering radium and other things. And you read about this in every introductory physics textbook. What you don't read about is that they were heavily involved in research into the paranormal. They were part of a group of 20 prominent European scientists who were doing such research in Paris early in the 20th century. The group included 5 Nobel Prize winners. The group did 2 years of experiments with the Italian medium Eusapia Palladino. And this woman had some very unusual powers, mind over matter, psychokinetic types of abilities. So on one occasion, they had the medium in the Psychology Institute in Paris, not in somebody's dark parlor, which is the normal sort of preconception. They had her in broad daylight in a scientific institution in Paris. They put her in a chair. Marie Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, held her hands. Other scientists held her feet, completely controlling her motions. And under these conditions, Pierre Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said that he observed a large table in the lab floating about a meter off the ground in the presence of this woman. And after 2 years of such results, the entire group of scientists signed documents saying these things are absolutely true, and we have to take them into account if we're going to have a complete picture of reality. But you're not going to read about this in your physics books today. In more recent times, Robert John, head of the engineering department at Princeton University, did some very interesting experiments with random number generators. Random number generators are computer-like machines that will generate as an output a genuinely random series of zeros and ones. If you let the machines run by themselves, they'll generate 50% zeros, 50% ones. But John and his colleagues asked students from the university to sit in front of these machines and simply will mentally that the machines produce more ones than zeros or more zeros than ones. And these experiments went on for over 10 years. They're very well documented. And the students were actually able to do it. They were actually able to cause the output of the random number generators to vary just according to their mental intention. So again, this is more evidence, I believe, for the existence of a subtle mind element associated with the human organism that can act on ordinary matter in ways we can't explain by our current laws of physics. There have also been some very interesting experiments carried out at universities in Europe on extrasensory perception. In these experiments, one person called a receiver is put into a very relaxed state. Meanwhile, at another location, another person called a sender is shown an image randomly selected by a computer. The sender tries to mentally send the image to the receiver. And then, at the end of each trial, the receiver is shown 4 images, one of which is the actual target image. And the receiver has to select from the 4, which was the image that was being sent. Now, if you run this experiment for tens of thousands of times, and you assume there's no paranormal effect, then you would expect that the receivers will pick the correct image 1 time out of 4, 25% of the time. However, the researchers find that the receivers are able to pick the image at a rate greatly exceeding 25% of the time, indicating they are able to pick up the mental image that is being sent to them by the sender. So there's a lot more that could be said, but I think this is sufficient to show that if we're going to talk about human origins, we can't just consider the chemical elements. I've tried to do in my book, Human Devolution, is give some rational scientific justification for thinking that these things are true. And I'm not claiming any monopoly on truth, either for myself or for the Vedic perspective. I think truth can be found in many places, and I encourage people to look wherever their path leads them. Mine has led me in a certain direction, but others may follow different paths. The first thing I want to show is that we really do need an alternative explanation for human origins in strictly scientific terms. Let's first look at what the current theories tell us. They tell us that life began on Earth from chemicals about 2 billion years ago. Then simple life forms arose in the oceans. Then they went to the land, which means that students will read about this evidence in their textbooks. People will see scientists talking about it on TV shows. If they go to the local museum, they'll see these discoveries. But if we have evidence that radically contradicts these fixed ideas, they tend to be ignored, forgotten, even actively suppressed. So I'm going to give a few examples of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist who I know personally. When she was a young woman, just after she got her PhD, she was a rising star in her profession. But then she was called to Mexico to date an archaeological site called Huayatlaco. This is the excavation at Huayatlaco. The American and Mexican archaeologists there found human artifacts, and evidence takes the form of human bones, human footprints, and human artifacts, many, many millions of years old. So I documented this evidence in this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which is about 900 pages long. Some people call it forbidding archaeology because it just seems like too much to pick up. So we brought out this book in a shorter edition called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which has now been translated into 20 languages. This is the Russian edition, the French edition. This is the Bulgarian edition. Now, the evidence that I document in these books is not very well known because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. We can call the blue box up there the knowledge filter, and it represents the fixed ideas that most scientists today now have about this question of human origins. So reports of evidence that conform to these fixed ideas will pass through this intellectual filter very easily. Layers of solid rock. And of course, they wanted to know how old they were. So they called a team of geologists to date the site. Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site. And they got an age of about 250,000 years. But the archaeologists said, we can't accept that. That's impossible. According to their theories, human beings capable of making the artifacts didn't exist anywhere in the world at that time. They hadn't evolved yet. So they refused to publish the age for the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. And Virginia Steen McIntyre decided, well, I'll independently publish the age for the site. If these archaeologists won't publish it, I will. So she did that. And when she did, she experienced an extreme negative backlash from her colleagues in the scientific world. She was labeled a troublemaker, a publicist, and then about 40 or 50 million years ago, you get the first apes and monkeys. And then about 6 million years ago, you get the first ape men. And then finally, about 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, you get humans like us for the first time on Earth. But ancient wisdom traditions tell a different story. For example, the ancient Sanskrit writings of India tell us that humans have existed since the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. We're not a recent appearance here. But many scientists will say, okay, well, that's what your mythology says, but all the physical evidence supports our point of view. It supports this evolutionary picture of human origins that we see here. But when I did 8 years of research into the entire history of archaeology, I found that there is physical evidence showing that humans like us have existed for millions and millions of years on Earth, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life here. And this